Good morning to all of you here. This is our first forum of the spring 2025 semester. Even though you probably or may not have been as sad as some of us were that we missed our first scheduled one with Bethany Ricks, we are still glad that you are here today. I invite you in this moment before we begin, go ahead and pull out those little AirPods, turn your phones down, close the computers if you have them open at this time. Today we have a panel that's going to be here. Dr. Gerald Mast will be introducing our people, but this is a particularly interesting forum as we start off the 500-year anniversary of Anabaptism. Dr. Gerald Mast.
500 years ago this month, on January 21, 1525, a small group of Bible reading and Jesus following young people decided to enact their faith in Jesus Christ and their protest against established Christendom through a clandestine baptism ceremony held in Anna Manz's small apartment in Zurich, in Switzerland. From this controversial act of faith grew an irrepressible social and spiritual movement that came to be known as Anabaptism, leading to the formation of Mennonite, Amish, Brethren, Hutterite, Apostolic, and Baptist churches, and the many institutions associated with these churches, such as Bluffton University. All of us at Bluffton, students, faculty, staff, administrators, and alumni, are part of this story because of our involvement in this Anabaptist institution. This semester, we are all invited to remember with gratitude the faithfulness of Anabaptist people and communities through 5 centuries, and to consider our commitments to Anabaptist practices of community, service, and peace that have shaped Bluffton's culture and faith heritage. Nearly 40 years ago, in 1987, a Bluffton religion professor by the name of J. Denny Weaver published a book entitled Becoming Anabaptist, in which he argued that Anabaptist Christianity is at least in part defined by how it poses an alternative way of life to the surrounding society. This alternative way of life follows the example and teachings of Jesus Christ, which lead to peace and reconciliation rather than to violence and nationalism. This way of life is never perfectly achieved, but rather a path of becoming more Christ-like, of becoming Anabaptist, as he puts it. I am delighted that the members of this panel have accepted the invitation to share with us their experience of becoming Anabaptist, of grappling with the challenging teachings of this movement that has shaped the faith and culture of Bluffton University. Our panelists include Micah Dodson, a sophomore social work major and communication and media minor, Melissa Friesen, professor of theater, Bill Hannafeld, sports information director, and Paul Neufeld-Weaver, professor of education and Spanish and director of global education, and Deborah Yoder, who is a 2023 graduate of Bluffton University and is the communications manager for the Coalition to Dismantle the Doctrine of Discovery, is zooming in to us from Oak Flat, Arizona. And we're very glad that that connection seems to be working for right now. So, we'll just move right ahead to the first question for discussion. When did you first become acquainted with Anabaptist teachings or stories?
I'm Melissa Friesen. I have the mic, so I guess I'll start with this question. So I grew up Mennonite, so it's been a part of my identity since I was very small. I attended Mennonite churches growing up, Sunday school. I went to church camp, summer vacation Bible school, all with a Mennonite flavor to them. My parents and grandparents were Mennonite. And as a child, I really absorbed that message that Jesus loves me and that my church family was very supportive and safe. Being kind and generous to others was a part of my earliest kind of faith formation. I was an avid reader, and as an elementary school kid, I read all kinds of things, but my parents made sure we had sort of Bible stories that we read, and some stories that emphasized peacemaking and social justice were a part of my growing up. Like, I don't know, those of you of a certain age might remember the Free to Be, You and Me storybooks that I grew up with, and a collection called Peace Be With You by Cornelia Lane, which was a book that celebrated peacemakers. So I had that as a child. I grew up in urban Kansas City, Kansas for my ages 2 through 12, and so was living in a diverse neighborhood, went to a Mennonite church, but a lot of my good friends were not Mennonite, and so I was exposed to a lot of different faiths there too, and so I learned from one of my best friends who was Catholic, that she went through confirmation, and I didn't have that, as part of my upbringing. I was baptized as a high school student, and my mom was a Mennonite minister, Mennonite pastor, so I actually was baptized by my mother, which was a pretty influential part of my life too.
All right, hi, my name is Micah, and I really started to become an Anabaptist when I first got baptized. I was baptized around middle school, and before that, I didn't really understand what Anabaptism was, but after my baptism, I really became interested and more of a connection with Anabaptism. And also, my father is a Mennonite pastor, and he also baptized me as well. So, yes.
Good morning. I'm Paul Neufeld-Weaver. I grew up hearing stories and teachings about serving others. For example, my parents going to Puerto Rico after they graduated from Bluffton College and helping to start a hospital there. I remember being asked to participate in helping clean up after natural disasters with Mennonite Disaster Service, trips to Kentucky and West Virginia that were very formative to me. I remember our family boycotting lettuce and grapes in support of striking farm workers in California. And my older siblings and other family members actively participated in the peace movement work, opposing the Vietnam War, supporting civil rights and farm workers' movements. And so these teachings and stories, I think, mostly came to me through the witness of the actions of others that I was around and modeling.
I first became acquainted with Anabaptism in the early 2000s as a student here at Bluffton University. And then when I met my would-be wife, who was a lifelong Mennonite and graduate of Central Christian High School in Kidron. I always attended and was baptized as a baby at Christ Lutheran Church, a very small congregation in Continental. So I had little knowledge of what Anabaptism referred to. Even as a student here, I did not have much, if any, understanding of what Anabaptism encompasses, but I will say that our church where we went was very similar to what we go to now, which is Grace Mennonite Church in Pandora.
Deborah Yoder, let's see if we can hear what she has to say. Deborah, can you hear me?
Yes. Sorry, my connection was cut off for a second. So what in the world? Okay. Sorry, folks. So to answer the question, I grew up Mennonite. Both my parents were Mennonite, and so they kind of raised me with stories and values that reflect Anabaptism through like a Mennonite lens. So I grew up hearing about like Mennonite pacifist beliefs and how often Mennonites had to flee from different countries they were living in because we wouldn't like take up arms to fight in wars. I grew up with the practice of baptism being like a very personal and individual choice. When I decided that I wanted to be baptized, I remember that my pastor came over to my house to discuss what that would mean. So he would ask me questions about like why I had made this decision and what it meant to me, just not as a test to see if I was ready, but more like if I understood what I was undertaking by choosing to be baptized and that no one had like coerced me or convinced me to do it. I also grew up hearing the story of Dirk Willems. It's a popular story among Anabaptists, or at least the Mennonites that I know. Willems escaped prison. He was imprisoned for being an Anabaptist because it was criminal offense at the beginning. And he ran across an iced-over river to escape his captors. But when one of his pursuers fell through the ice, trying to capture him and run after him, Willems turned back and helped the man to safety and saved his life. Apparently the man didn't then want to take Willems back to prison, but he had to. That was his job. And Willems was recaptured, tortured, and killed. So that's kind of a popular story I grew up hearing from my parents, and it's kind of dramatic, but I think it shows a lot of the values of Anabaptists and Mennonites, kind of a selflessness in action, trying to save someone who, you know, might be trying to harm you, but, you know, they are also a child of God. They are also a person whose life is precious. And so we cannot put our own lives above the lives of another person. I hope that answers the question. And I hope you could hear me most of the time.
Yeah, thank you, Deborah. We could hear you. Next question. What does Anabaptism mean to you? Which teachings or practices in Anabaptism have had the most influence on the way you live your life and carry out your work?
Although I was not familiar with the word or meaning of pacifism through over half of my life, I believe that it is something that was ingrained in me from my parents based on just the way that they lived. We never talked about the word, but turning the other cheek was more than a Kenny Rogers lyric. It was what felt right. Avoiding conflict was always a priority, especially with my mom, and finding solutions that were nonviolent seemed like the most productive use of our energy within the family.
Anabaptism to me means taking Jesus' words seriously and his life example and his teachings as models for us today, peacemaking and nonviolent resistance to conflict as being important, and pacifism as a stance. A call to be loving and to all people, and to care for those in particular who are at the margins of society or are powerless in society, clothing the naked, feeding the hungry, visiting those in prison. Simple living and stewardship of the earth is a core Anabaptist belief, I believe, and the importance of community, being part of a church, being part of a group of people who are studying together, following Jesus together, reading the Bible together. So probably the biggest influences are that orientation towards nonviolence and pacifism, and questioning theologies or philosophies that champion winning or power over others. So my faith has definitely influenced some major life decisions, like what profession I would go into, a teaching profession, and where I would do it. That I wanted very much to teach at a Mennonite school, and I'm very happy to be at Bluffton, and have been here for a couple decades now. My faith also influenced the way I work and study, including the topic for my dissertation was about the nonviolent spectator as critic, so taking a nonviolent philosophy and applying that to the study of theater. And I've developed a course like Theater for Social Change as an example, which to me embodies some of those core values.
Yeah, I feel like for me personally, I'm not 100% sure how Anabaptism applies to my life, but I'm still discovering who I am and how this applies. But I've learned that, again, I want to be more of a pacifist through my words and through my actions. And also I feel like applying Anabaptism into my life has taught me to listen to people, especially people who I don't agree with, and yeah.
So there are many Anabaptist teachings and practices that have had a really strong influence on me, and they are largely rooted in the Sermon on the Mount and other teachings of Jesus. When I made the decision to follow Jesus as a child, I knew that it meant I would try to take seriously what Jesus asks his followers to do. Share what I have with others, especially those in need, become part of the family of God, sisters and brothers in the faith who seek together to understand and do God's will, and to love others. The most challenging one, and the one which really caught my interest, which has been mentioned by a couple of others here, was loving your enemies. It seemed almost a contradiction in terms, since typically enemies are those who hate you and those who you hate, right? What does it mean to love those people? Deborah gave an example, right? When I was in middle school, it was still in the middle of the Cold War, and our nation's enemies were the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc communist countries. I felt that if I was going to figure out how to love my enemies, I should be able to communicate with them at the bare minimum. And so I went to a bookstore, and I found this book when I was 12 called Look and Learn Russian. And I started trying to learn Russian. It was my first effort at language learning. And I spent about 8 years trying to teach myself Russian. I can say about 3 phrases today in Russian. Eventually, though, this interest grew into an interest in other languages. And I guess I'm a little ADHD because I currently have 12 languages open on my Duolingo app. I threw myself also into peacemaking activism and academic study of poverty and underdevelopment, trying to understand why there was so much inequality and suffering in the world. So those 3 interests is what led me to a lifetime of engaging with Latin America in many ways, including living, serving, studying, and working in Honduras, Costa Rica, Mexico, Colombia, and Guatemala. Pretty much almost always beside other Anabaptists there who showed me and taught me so much about what it meant to be Anabaptist. And then that is what led me here to Bluffton to do the work I do today.
Deborah, what are your thoughts about the meaning of Anabaptism?
For a long time, I wasn't quite sure what Anabaptism, or I wasn't sure if I knew what Anabaptism was or if I really identified with it. But as I've grown older and have encountered more Anabaptists and other communities, I've come to see how it has really shaped my values. I think one of the moments I felt most connected to my faith is when I'm in community with others actively working for justice. When I'm part of a church community that doesn't ignore what's happening in the world around us, but takes a look and says, what would Jesus do here? Let's respond. And actually, when the genocide in Gaza first started, I was attending a church that actively grieved the atrocity instead of just ignoring it on Sunday mornings. We would grieve together every morning as a community, and really meant an action process on grief about the situation rather than feeling isolated and paralyzed by what was happening in the world. And the organization Mennonite Action was started. Their mission is to take public action against God free. And when I first learned about them, I thought, oh, this is really cool. It's Mennonites taking action for what they believe in. And in January of that day, I was at work, but I actually stopped what I was doing and I watched the live stream on Instagram. And I just felt such a rightness, such a connection with the folks who were in the rotunda and just my faith community. I was like, this is what it means to be Anabaptist, right? To be taking up this action, to be singing hymns in the place of power in DC, calling for ceasefire and for justice. So I think I would describe Anabaptism as faith in action, taking the teachings of Jesus seriously into daily practice, holding compassion for the oppressed, and holding those in power accountable. The values I really lean into that I've learned from my parents, my extended family, and my communities are justice, community, and loving kindness and compassion for your neighbor and for your enemy. These are values that are also expressed in my workplace, actually. So the Coalition to Dismantle the Doctrine of Discovery is where I work. And these values are also part of the reason that I'm here at Oak Flat. I'm praying and seeking protection for the sacred land of Oak Flat, sacred to San Carlos Apache people, and it is currently under threat by a copper mining company. Mining the copper underground the land would destroy this sacred site by creating a 2-mile wide and 1,100 100-foot deep crater here, and it would render the practice of Apache religion impossible because it would destroy the land here. So for me and my work, I've learned so much has already been taken from the first people of the Americas, the indigenous nations. And so with my understanding of Jesus's teachings of justice, I have to work to try to stop this cycle of abuse. And so that is why I'm here. And I've heard that there's a forum on November 4th that will also talk about Oak Flat. So if you're interested in learning more, I'd encourage you to attend that.
All right, thank you. Third question, how have Anabaptist communities and people impacted your life?
So I decided to wear this shirt today. My wife looked at me and said, "What are you doing?" But because there's pictures of, you can't really see the pictures here, but it says, in Spanish, it says, "Peace takes guts. La paz requiere agallas." And there was a version of this shirt when I was in college that had Anabaptist forebears on it. And then later someone in Latin America made this version, which has Latin American people who've carried forward the vision of peacemaking. And two of whom I've met, but all of whom have been mentors in different ways for me. So a major impact on me has been a 39-year involvement with community peacemaker teams, which is an Anabaptist-inspired organization which accompanies people working for peace and human rights in conflict zones around the world. I am learning that the call of Jesus to be peacemakers is not only a lifelong commitment, but it means becoming part of a stream, a river really, of peace builders, teachers, and agitators, which goes back thousands of years in the past and will continue thousands of years in the future. Jesus doesn't ask us for a list of our accomplishments. Jesus asks us to get into the river and get wet and sometimes get muddy.
I'll say personally, I met a lot of good people through my Anabaptist communities, like pastors, people, and just youth groups and everything. And also I felt I've definitely been introduced to different cultures. An example is every other month of the year, we have in my church group, we have a joint service where we have a Swahili church come in. And it's really amazing seeing different cultures come together. And after that, I've grown to appreciate my culture and other cultures as well. So.
Anabaptist communities and people have impacted my life tremendously since I grew up in the church. One way is the churches have nurtured and affirmed some of my leadership gifts. And I got to see some strong models of leadership, and my mom was real influential in my life in that as a Mennonite pastor. And my congregations encouraged young people to participate in the life of the worshiping community, including worship leading, song leading. I played violin and piano in my church services, that kind of a thing as well. I attended a Mennonite college, and my professors there and my peers, my friends were quite influential in being role models to me, and demonstrating to me how the various academic disciplines can intersect with ideas of faith and social justice in particular. And participating in the arts has been really helpful for me, and especially connecting arts and Anabaptist philosophy. Participating in concert choir when I was in college as a college student was quite influential. Attending Mennonite conventions in the summer and hearing from Ted and Lee and Ken Miedema, seeing musicals like The Upside Down King, an original musical written by Doug and Jude Crable. Those have been really influential in my life. And then, as others have talked about, seeing the activism and service, participating with Mennonite Disaster Service, going on learning tours to the Texas Mexico border with some members of my church here with First Mennonite Church. Those have all been very influential in my life.
Anabaptist communities and people in those communities have had a tremendous impact on my life. The family I married into and the school that I've spent the last 24 years of my life have shaped who I am in more ways than I could list. At this point, my story is centered around our family and the people of Bluffton College / Bluffton University / Bluffton College, or whatever else they call us in a year from now. Although I work in a position where wins and losses show up daily on that scoreboard, the true wins are the relationships that we've cemented with the folks who have worked here and the students who came into our lives for far longer than the 4 years it actually took to earn those degrees.
Deborah, what are your thoughts about Anabaptist communities and people that have influenced you? Deborah, third question.
My turn?
Yeah, there we go.
All right. Okay. Having a little trouble hearing. Yeah, so how have Anabaptist communities and people impacted my life? I feel like I mentioned this a little bit with the previous question about the communities I've been a part of and connected the, I think, action for justice and community building. Most of the Anabaptist communities I've been part of have taught me the importance of service and community. There are a lot of service-oriented Mennonite organizations, and they work across the globe. And I think partly because Mennonites don't serve in the military, so we have alternative forms of service, like civic service that we participate in, and volunteering kinds of things. Learning this value of service is one of the reasons that I did Mennonite voluntary service for a year after graduating Bluffton. It's a service where you spend a year in a new location, volunteering with a local organization, and you're kind of living with other young adults doing this process together. And I really, really did lean into the values of service that year and of community, because I was building a house with 4 other people I hadn't known previously. And we created a tight bond and connected with the church that was supporting us there. So I think, giving and acts of service and building community are the values that I really learned from churches, my parents, and my extended family. And that's my
Okay, the next question has 2 parts to it. In what ways does Bluffton University reflect Anabaptist convictions and values? And in what ways could it do better in reflecting those convictions and values?
I think at its core, Bluffton was and is best described by the words of Don Schweingruber, who said it's all about relationships. And to take that further, I think the more relationships you develop, the easier it is to see peace as the true solution. Working to show that peace is the vehicle best suited to travel through all terrains is something that Bluffton has always strived to do. Pacifists have often had to struggle with being heard through the outside noise. It's even harder today with violence, the bulk of what you see on your screens and news feeds. This should only serve to strengthen our resolve to be a much-needed port in the storm. Places like Bluffton are crucial for the well-being of our community and country if we are to not only survive, but to thrive.
I see a lot of ways that Bluffton University reflects Anabaptist convictions and values, from the Lion and Lamb Peace Arts Center and Peace Club, sort of an investment of students into those programs and faculty and staff. Forum speakers and topics, colloquial topics that we engage with, the C. Henry Smith Peace Oratorical Contest. I see an Anabaptist orientation towards an invitational approach to faith. So we don't require chapel, for example, at Bluffton, but we invite, everyone to join. Faculty and staff who teach here don't have to sign a particular loyalty pledge or conviction statement, but we do prioritize in hiring people who will support the values of the institution and be open to supporting those. And I feel really proud to be a part of an institution that does that. I see it in our curriculum, in our blueprint, our Bluffton blueprint, because of the Mission Corps classes. One place in particular I see it is in our cross-cultural program, a way to encourage service and learning across all sorts of different cultures. And I hope we're always striving to do better, to live up to our convictions. Our mission statement that we seek to prepare all students for life as well as vocation, I think, is a challenge for us to continually work at. I'm a little worried right now in the current political climate about what will happen with DEI is the catchword right now, and I do think becoming a more and more welcoming and inclusive place is an important part of Bluffton's mission, and so I think that's an area that we can continue to strive to do better, and we'll maybe need to do better in the future. And I'd love to see investments, even it's a difficult time for everybody financially, of course, and we'll see what happens with the merger, but for us to invest in things like church relations work and kind of cultivating those connections with the wider church body.
Yeah, I would say, especially with Bluffton, I feel like Bluffton introduces a way to view the world through an Anabaptist lens. And one example is the class learning and community. Like, I've learned just kind of how to view the world through an Anabaptist lens. And also, I feel like one way Bluffton could improve is reaching out to those with non-Anabaptist backgrounds, and just a little bit more with that. So,
my kids are all adults now, but when they were growing up, they loved to read, and sometimes I read books with them. And a lot of these books were like mystery/adventure books where there's something going on and people are trying to figure out and link all these different clues and patterns together and figure out what's really going on. And I think sometimes when someone comes to Bluffton, it may seem like that. There's, okay, this happened in this class and this happened here, and I'm not sure how this all makes sense. And I think the key that you find out at the end of the book, but we're going to tell you now, is to understand Anabaptism. I think Anabaptism undergirds so much. I've learned so much about being faithful to Jesus by interacting with colleagues, not just those from a Mennonite or Anabaptist background, but all my colleagues, with students who've taught me things, with staff members, community members, alumni. Bluffton's core values do align with Anabaptist core values, and I have seen those values lived out by so many students, alumni, staff, faculty, administrators, and supporters, most of whom are not Mennonite. Recognizing that all people are beloved by God is both an Anabaptist and a Bluffton value, core value. Recognizing that all people of the world are my siblings is both an Anabaptist and a Bluffton core value. Preparing myself diligently to live a life which will promote, model, and live out the reconciling work of God in the world is a core value. The things that everyone, my colleagues have mentioned here, these friends have mentioned, are all part of that. And beating swords into plowshares, dedicating ourselves and all around us to be instruments of God's peace is a core value. I invite each and every one of you to visit the Lion and Lamb Peace Arts Center right here on Bluffton's campus to talk about, learn about, and practice our core value of peacemaking.
Deborah.
Yeah. So Bluffton University has a real focus on community, and as I was talking about earlier, that's, I think, a really big Anabaptist value. Community and community building is talked about a lot on campus, at least while I was there, with the, it's all about relationships. Freshman week orientation, you have your BAS groups, and you're trying to build community together before your classes start. And so, that's, I think, a really big value that Bluffton has as part of its core identity. And then I think they also place a lot of value on intercultural exchange and with cross-cultural requirements. I think the valuing of cross-cultural experience is also something that Mennonites have. A lot of Mennonites outside the U.S. doing voluntary work on learning trips. And this is also connected to service. And I think, in capstone senior year, students research, I think the UN Declaration or the UN Development Goals and the progress that's still needed for those. So that's sort of service-oriented, how are we trying to make the world better as we go out and start our careers and our jobs, and things like that. And thinking about how Bluffton could do better, At the end of the day, Bluffton is an institution held to certain standards by the board of directors, and you're starting to merge with Findlay University. And so your identity coming out of that will have to, that remains to be seen how that occurs. And as I understand Anabaptism, it was sort of a radical anti-institutional movement because it stood against the Catholic Church and the state government were very intertwined at the time. And I remember when I was a student, to get the Black Lives Matter mural approved on the Bluffton campus, and projects like Beaver Monologues, which center student voices and experience, also struggled to get approved. And so I would say, though, if Bluffton does want to implement these values or connect more, I would say listen to your students, support their projects and initiatives, because that will build better community on campus. And I think I'm entering a zone now where connection will be a little more unstable, so I might disconnect to the next level.
Thanks, Deborah. Those were my questions, and we do have some time to reflect on the panel's responses and to formulate some questions or comments of our own. So I'll give us maybe 2 or 3 minutes thinking about how you would answer these questions or what questions do you have for the panelists, and then I'll run the mic around. All right. If you have a question, you're welcome to direct it at any specific panelist, or you can just ask the question for the panel in general, and we'll see who has a response to it. Who has a question or comment? Raise your hand, and I'll bring the mic to you.
So this forum is partly based on the assertion that Anabaptism is a unique or different in some respects from Christianity in general. Why is that distinction important, how is it manifest in the institution?
It's kind of a big theology question. Who would like to take it on?
Well, I'll take on part of it or just comment a little bit. So some of the most convinced and faithful Anabaptists I've known have not been part of the Anabaptist tradition. Catholics, Methodists, Lutherans, and sometimes people of other faiths as well. But they are different than the way sometimes mainstream Christianity is portrayed, and maybe is, which I think that the very things we talked about here distinguish the Anabaptist practice, which is not, I don't think, is unique to Anabaptists. I think St. Francis of Assisi, for example, Catholic, very much embodied those. And so there's these strains through many different groups, but this is our roots. This is where we come from, but it can be embraced by a much larger group. And it is counter to much of popular culture and dominant culture in our society, which supports many things that, to me, seem to be exactly the opposite of what Jesus taught.
I might just give a stab at answering that question, partly because it intersects with the Becoming Anabaptist book that I mentioned earlier by J. Denny Weaver. That book, it was part of a theological movement to frame an Anabaptist theology toward the end of the 20th century. Up until that point, the main way you would be an Anabaptist would be to join a Mennonite church or an Amish church, or to grow up in that context. Because Anabaptism had been so marginal in the Christian church, and those groups were so separated from the larger society, it was actually hard to become an Anabaptist. So Denny's book, Becoming Anabaptist, is this kind of invitation to anyone, of whatever your religious background, who shares some of these values to identify with that tradition. So now we do have people who claim to be Anglican Anabaptists or Lutheran Anabaptists. And I think Bill is sort of an example of that, a Lutheran Anabaptist. So that question is in some ways easier to answer now than it was maybe longer ago, because there are certain values that are grouped together and identified with Anabaptism that are not unique absolutely. People in many different contexts can share them. And I think it's true for Bluffton, which is a place where we have, for much of our history, not had a majority of Mennonite students or Anabaptist students, but many students who graduated with a commitment to those convictions and those values, even if they did not become Mennonite. Other questions? Yeah.
So this question, I'm sorry, Bill, I'm going to put you on the spot so you can like take a breath and emotionally prepare for that. I'm really, like, you have a really important role on this campus, right? Like, you tell the story of more than 3/4 of our students as sport information director. And you have this insight into our world of athletics that many of us as faculty and staff do not. I'm curious if there is anything that comes to mind for you in terms of ways that you see these values undergird our athletics programs and touching those student athletes' lives that maybe not be obvious to the rest of us or to them.
I'm not sure. I mean, I think just the kids that come to Bluffton, I think when you see who they are as they get here and then 2, 3, 4 years later, I think it's pretty obvious that, you know, the values that Bluffton portrays are pretty much what the kids walk out of here with, whether that's how they play or, you know, how they react and respond on campus. I think this is a great place, and I think that the kids embody, you know, what it is we're trying to teach them.
Right, time for one more, if there's someone who has one more question. Anyone in the back want to make me run back there? All right, thank you for your attention. You're dismissed.